The harsh Nevada sun beat down on Sheriff William Tanner as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon pass. July 1883 was proving to be particularly unforgiving, the drought having lasted nearly 3 months. His deputy, a young man named Charles Foster, followed close behind, his handkerchief pulled up over his nose to shield against the dust kicked up by their horses. "How much farther, Sheriff?" Foster called out, his voice muffled. "Should be just around this bend," Tanner replied, pulling his hat lower to shield his eyes. The Wilkins boy said he found it while tracking a wounded deer. The "it" in question was what brought them out to Red Rock Canyon, some 20 miles from the small mining town of Silverton. Just yesterday, 16-year-old Timothy Wilkins had stumbled into the sheriff's office, pale and shaking, claiming he'd found an abandoned camp where something terrible happened. As they rounded the bend, Tanner pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted. The camp lay before them, nestled against the canyon wall where a small spring trickled from the rocks. 2 canvas tents still stood, though one had partially collapsed. A cold fire pit sat in the center, pots and pans scattered around it as if abandoned in haste. "My God," Foster whispered as he dismounted, his eyes fixed on the dark stains that marked the sand near the campfire. Tanner knelt to examine the stains. "Blood," he confirmed grimly. "A lot of it." He stood and surveyed the scene. But no bodies. They approached the tents cautiously, hands resting on their revolvers. The first tent contained 2 bedrolls, a small trunk of clothing, and mining equipment, picks, shovels, and pans for gold. A ledger sat atop a wooden crate that served as a table. Tanner flipped it open, revealing neat handwriting detailing expenses and small amounts of gold dust collected. "Herrera," he read from the inside cover. Miguel and Rafael Herrera. The second tent told a different story. The bedroll was torn, the canvas wall behind it slashed. More blood stained the ground. A rifle lay broken in 2 pieces. There was a struggle, Foster observed unnecessarily. Tanner nodded, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. "But where are the bodies? And why is their equipment still here?" Gold miners didn't abandon their claims, especially not ones that were producing even small amounts. As they continued searching the camp, Foster called out from behind a boulder some 30 feet away. "Sheriff, over here." Tanner hurried over to find his deputy, pointing at a series of marks in the hard-packed earth. "Tracks," Foster said. "Looks like something heavy was dragged from the camp." Tanner knelt to examine them. 2 sets of drag marks. 2 bodies, maybe. He followed the tracks with his eyes as they led away from the camp toward the deeper recesses of the canyon. "And look here." He pointed other tracks alongside the drag marks. "Boot prints. 3 different sizes." Foster's hand instinctively moved to his gun. "You think whoever did this is still out here?" Tanner stood, brushing the dust from his knees. "This happened days ago, maybe a week. But something isn't right." He looked back toward the camp. "Why leave the gold pans and tools? Even a small amount of gold dust would be worth stealing." As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the canyon, Tanner made a decision. "We'll take what evidence we can back to town, then return with more men to follow these tracks." Neither man spoke much as they gathered the ledger and a few personal effects to help identify the brothers. The silent canyon seemed to watch them, and more than once Foster glanced nervously over his shoulder at the deepening shadows. "You feel that, Sheriff?" he finally asked as they mounted their horses. "Feel what?" Foster hesitated, struggling to find the words. "Like we're being watched." Tanner surveyed the canyon walls, seeing nothing but rock and scrub brush. "It's just the quiet playing tricks on you." But he nudged his horse to a quicker pace as they left the canyon, the mystery of the Herrera brothers' fate weighing heavily on his mind. The next morning, Tanner assembled a search party of 6 men, including Foster and the town's doctor, Howard Green. The group rode out at dawn, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before the midday heat made their work unbearable. Upon returning to the camp, Tanner directed the men to fan out and search for any sign of the Herrera brothers or their attackers. Dr. Green examined the bloodstains, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. "This is a substantial amount of blood, Sheriff," he said, crouching beside one of the larger stains. "I'd say at least one of them bled out here, perhaps both." Tanner nodded grimly. "But still no bodies." They followed the drag marks from the previous day, tracking them deeper into the canyon. The path narrowed, forcing them to proceed single file, the canyon walls rising imposingly on either side. "The marks stop here," announced Eli Morgan, a local hunter known for his tracking skills. They stood at the mouth of a small cave, the entrance barely large enough for a man to pass through. The drag marks led directly inside. "We'll need lanterns," Tanner said. 2 men returned to the horses to retrieve them, while the others waited uneasily at the cave entrance. "You know," Foster said quietly to Tanner, "I've heard stories about these canyons. Old miner I played cards with told me the Paiute won't come here. Say these places are haunted." Tanner frowned. "We're not here for ghost stories, Foster. When the lanterns arrived, Tanner took one and led the way into the cave, followed by Foster and Dr. Green. The other men waited outside, their hands resting nervously on their weapons. The cave opened into a larger chamber, the lantern light casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The air was stale and carried a faint metallic odor that Tanner recognized immediately. More blood. There, Foster pointed. In the corner of the chamber lay a pile of clothing, torn and stiff with dried blood. Dr. Green moved closer, examining the items. A shirt, trousers. Looks like they were cut from the body. Tanner held his lantern higher, illuminating more of the chamber. Over here. Against the far wall were scratch marks, dozens of them, as if someone had clawed desperately at the stone. Foster swallowed audibly. What happened here, Sheriff? Before Tanner could answer, a voice called from outside the cave. Sheriff Tanner, you better come see this. They emerged from the cave to find Morgan and another searcher, James Wilson, standing several yards away, looking down at something partially covered by loose stones. Found this while checking the area, Morgan said, pointing to what appeared to be a journal, its leather cover weathered and stained. Tanner picked it up carefully and opened it. The handwriting matched that in the ledger, neat, precise strokes in what appeared to be Spanish. Interspersed with the writing were detailed sketches, geological formations, maps of the canyon, and curious symbols that Tanner didn't recognize. Can you read Spanish, Sheriff? Dr. Green asked. Tanner shook his head. Mrs. Alvarez in town can translate, but look here. He pointed to the final pages of the journal where the writing changed, becoming erratic and rushed. The last entry was in English, the letters jagged and barely legible. They come at night. They watch from the shadows. Not animals, not man. God help us. A chill ran through the group despite the heat of the day. There's something else, Wilson said. He led them to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, where a small object glinted in the sunlight. Reaching in, he carefully extracted a silver pocket watch. Tanner took it, turning it over in his palm. The initials were engraved on the back. Miguel Herrera, he murmured. As he opened the watch, a folded piece of paper fell out. Tanner unfolded it to reveal a small, crude map drawn in what looked like charcoal, showing the canyon and a location marked with an X. Where does this lead? Foster asked, peering over Tanner's shoulder. Tanner oriented himself in the canyon, comparing the map to their surroundings. If I'm reading this right, it's about 2 miles further in, near the old abandoned mine. Dr. Green frowned. That mine was closed 10 years ago after a collapse killed 5 men. Nobody goes there anymore. The Herrera brothers did, Tanner said, tucking the map into his pocket, and I intend to find out why. The abandoned mine entrance loomed before them like an open wound in the canyon wall. Weathered timbers framed the entrance, many rotted or broken, while a sign warning danger, do not enter, hung askew from a single rusty nail. Tanner and his men approached cautiously, their horses growing increasingly agitated as they neared the mine. After tethering the animals a safe distance away, the sheriff addressed the group. Dr. Green, you and Wilson stay with the horses. Foster, Morgan, and Parker will come with me. Jenkins, keep watch out here. The men nodded, though their expressions betrayed their unease. Sheriff, Jenkins said hesitantly, that collapsed 10 years ago. My father was one of the rescue crew. He said they never found all the bodies. Tanner acknowledged this with a grim nod. All the more reason to be careful. We'll check inside, but we won't go past any unsafe areas, armed with lanterns and their revolvers. Tanner led Foster, Morgan, and Parker into the mine. The tunnel sloped gently downward, the air growing cooler and damper as they descended. Rotted support beams creaked ominously overhead, and more than once they had to navigate around fallen debris. The map shows a chamber about 50 yards in, Tanner said, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow passage. As they advanced, Morgan suddenly stopped. Look there, he said, pointing his lantern toward the ground. Fresh boot prints marked the dusty floor leading deeper into the mine. How recent? Tanner asked. Morgan crouched to examine them. Within the past week, I'd say. Same size as those we found at the camp. They followed the prints cautiously until the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. Their lanterns revealed mining equipment scattered about, pickaxes, shovels, and a rusted ore cart on damaged tracks. But what drew their attention was the far wall, where the rock face had been recently worked. Someone's been digging here, Foster observed, moving closer to examine the fresh marks in the stone. Tanner joined him, running his hand over the wall. This wasn't part of the original mine operation. He pointed to a narrow seam of quartz running through the rock. Look at this, it's shot through with gold. Morgan whistled low. Rich vein. The Herrera brothers must have found it and started working it secretly, but why here? Parker asked, glancing nervously at the unstable-looking ceiling. This mine's dangerous. There's plenty of safer places to prospect. Tanner's lantern light fell on something half buried in the loose rock at the base of the wall. Kneeling, he carefully extracted a small leather pouch. Inside were several nuggets of gold, larger than any he'd seen come out of the Silverton area in years. "I think this answers your question," he said, showing the others. "Greed makes men take risks." As they continued examining the chamber, Foster called out from a small alcove to the side, "Sheriff, there's another tunnel here." The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, and appeared to have been recently excavated. It led away from the main mine workings deeper into the mountain. "This isn't on the map," Tanner said, comparing it with the crude drawing they'd found. A decision had to be made. The tunnel looked unstable, yet it might hold answers about the Herrera brothers' fate. "I'll go," Tanner said. "The rest of you stay here." "Sheriff, you can't go alone," Foster protested. "I'm not asking," Tanner replied firmly. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, get out and bring help." Before anyone could argue further, Tanner ducked into the narrow passage, his lantern held out before him. The tunnel twisted and turned, forcing him to stoop in places. The air grew thinner, staler, and an unnatural silence pressed in around him. After several minutes of careful progress, the tunnel opened into another chamber. Smaller than the first, but clearly the object of intense interest to whoever had dug it. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols he'd seen in the journal, carved directly into the rock. In the center of the room stood a crude altar made of stacked stones, and upon it lay a leather-bound book, much older and more weathered than the Herrera journal. Tanner approached cautiously, his lantern illuminating the bizarre scene. The book lay open to pages filled with text in a language he didn't recognize, alongside disturbing illustrations of human-like figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. A sudden noise from behind made him spin around, gun drawn. The lantern light caught a flash of movement at the tunnel entrance, but when he moved closer to investigate, he found nothing. An inexplicable dread settled over him, and for the first time in his 20 years as sheriff, William Tanner felt truly afraid. Something was very wrong here, beyond the mystery of two missing miners. Quickly, he took the book from the altar, tucked it inside his coat, and headed back toward the tunnel. As he ducked to enter the passage, his lantern illuminated something on the ground that hadn't been there before, a single boot print in the dust. Still fresh, pointing toward the chamber he'd just left. Back in Silverton that evening, Tanner sat in his office with Dr. Green and Mrs. Elena Alvarez, the widow of a Mexican miner who had settled in town years ago. Before them on the desk lay the journal of the Herrera brothers and the strange book from the altar. "This journal," Mrs. Alvarez said, her fingers tracing the Spanish text, "it begins as a record of their mining operation. Miguel was the writer, it seems. He talks about finding an old map in Santa Fe that led them to this canyon, to gold that had never been claimed." "Does he mention the abandoned mine?" Tanner asked. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, turning a page. "Here, about 3 weeks ago. They discovered the mine and realized the previous operation had missed a rich vein. They began working it secretly." She continued reading, her expression growing troubled. "Then 2 weeks ago the tone changes. Miguel writes that they found a sealed chamber while expanding their dig. Inside was an altar and an ancient book." She looked up at the leather-bound tome Tanner had recovered. "This book, I presume." Dr. Green carefully opened it, revealing pages of faded text and disturbing illustrations. "This language. It's not one I recognize." "Miguel didn't either," Mrs. Alvarez continued, "but he became obsessed with it. He writes that he spent hours trying to decipher it, copying the symbols." She flipped to the pages containing the strange markings Tanner had seen. He believed it contained the secret to an even greater treasure hidden deeper in the mountain. "And his brother?" Tanner prompted. "Raphael wanted to leave. He said the place felt wrong, that they were disturbing something that should be left alone." Mrs. Alvarez turned to the final pages of the journal. The last coherent entries speak of noises in the night, shadows moving around their camp when no one was there. Raphael claimed someone was watching them from the canyon walls. She translated the final Spanish entry. "Raphael is right, we are not alone here. I have seen them too now, watching from the darkness. We will leave tomorrow, take what gold we have, and abandon this claim. Some treasures are not meant to be found." The last entry, the one in broken English that Tanner had already seen, needed no translation. Dr. Green leaned back in his chair, his scholarly face troubled. "Sheriff, these men were educated, rational. What could have frightened them so badly?" Tanner had no answer. He recounted what they'd found at the mine, the rich gold vein, the newly excavated tunnel, the chamber with the altar. But he omitted the fresh boot print he'd found, the feeling of being watched. Some details felt too fantastical, too easily dismissed. "There's one more thing," he said instead, retrieving a telegram that had arrived that afternoon. "I wired Santa Fe about the Herrera brothers. They were well-known prospectors there, respected men, but according to this, they weren't brothers at all. Miguel Herrera was a professor of archaeology at a university in Mexico City. Rafael was his guide and assistant. Archaeologists posing as miners? Dr. Green's eyebrows rose in surprise. It would explain their interest in the book, the symbols, Tanner reasoned. But not what happened to them. Mrs. Alvarez, who had been quietly examining the ancient book, suddenly gasped. "Sheriff, look at this." She pointed to a particular illustration that depicted the canyon where the men had camped. Below it was text and a crude drawing of elongated figures emerging from the shadows. "The local Paiute have stories," she said quietly. "Tales of ancient ones who dwell in certain canyons, in caves where the sun never reaches. They say these beings guard sacred sites, treasures from before human time. The Paiute avoid such places, especially at night." Foster, who had been silently standing guard at the door, shifted uncomfortably. "That old miner I mentioned, Sheriff? He said the same thing. Called them shadow people. Said they take those who disturb their resting places." Tanner had always considered himself a practical man, unmoved by superstition. Yet the evidence before him, the abandoned camp, the blood, the desperate final message, and the fresh tracks where no one should have been, defied rational explanation. "Whatever happened," he said finally, "2 men are missing, presumed dead. My job is to find them, or at least bring their killers to justice, and if their killers aren't—" "Men?" Foster asked hesitantly. Tanner didn't answer. Night had fallen outside, and the lamp in his office seemed suddenly inadequate against the darkness pressing in at the windows. Dr. Green gathered his coat, preparing to leave. "What will you do now, Sheriff?" "Tomorrow we'll return to the canyon with more men," Tanner decided. "Search every inch of those caves and the mine. If the Herrera brothers are there, dead or alive, we'll find them." As they departed, leaving Tanner alone in his office, he found himself staring at the ancient book, at the disturbing figures depicted on its pages. For the first time in his career, William Tanner wasn't sure if he wanted to find the answers he sought. Dawn broke cold and gray over Silverton, unusual for July. Tanner stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, watching as a group of 10 men gathered in the street, armed with rifles, revolvers, and pickaxes. Among them were Foster, Dr. Green, Morgan, and several miners who knew the area well. Conspicuously absent was James Wilson, who had failed to report as promised. A quick check at his boarding house revealed his bed hadn't been slept in. "Has anyone seen Wilson since yesterday?" Tanner asked the group. The men exchanged glances and shook their heads. "He was at the saloon last night," offered Sam Parker, a local rancher. "Said he was heading home around 9. Seemed agitated about something. A knot formed in Tanner's stomach. First the Herrera brothers, now Wilson. But he kept his concern to himself, not wanting to alarm the others before they even set out. "We'll check his usual spots in town on our way back," Tanner said. "For now, let's focus on the task at hand." The ride to Red Rock Canyon was somber, the men unusually quiet. Even the landscape seemed subdued under the overcast sky, the typically vibrant red rocks muted to a dull rust color. They reached the Herrera camp by mid-morning. Nothing had changed since their last visit, yet Tanner couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, as if the camp had been disturbed in their absence. "Morgan, Parker, Jenkins, secure the camp area," Tanner ordered. "The rest of you come with me to the mine. We'll split into 2 groups once there," as they rode deeper into the canyon, following the now familiar path to the abandoned mine. Foster moved his horse alongside Tanner's. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "did you notice anything strange about the camp?" So Tanner wasn't the only one who had sensed it. "Like what?" Foster hesitated. "The bloodstains. They looked different. Darker, spread out more, as if someone had, examined them." Before Tanner could respond, they rounded a bend and came within sight of the mine entrance. They all pulled up short. The warning sign had been torn down. The timbers framing the entrance, which had been weathered but intact 2 days ago, now lay splintered and broken around the opening, as if something had violently forced its way out. "What the hell happened here?" muttered one of the miners. Tanner dismounted, approaching the entrance cautiously, his hand on his revolver. The others followed, spreading out to examine the area. "Tracks everywhere," Morgan reported, crouching to study the ground. "Different sizes, some boots, I'm not sure." He pointed to strange, elongated impressions in the dirt. "Never seen prints like these before." Dr. Green joined him, frowning at the unusual tracks. "Almost like someone walking on their toes, but the stride is too long for a man." Tanner made a decision. "We proceed as planned, but with caution. No one goes anywhere alone." He divided the men into 2 groups, one to search the main chamber they'd found before, the other to accompany him further in, to the chamber with the altar. Inside, the mine was noticeably different. The passage seemed wider, the ceiling higher, as if the very rock had shifted. Fresh debris littered the floor, and the air carried a strange metallic odor stronger than before. In the main chamber, the evidence of change was even more dramatic. The wall where the Herrera brothers had been working the gold vein was now partially collapsed, revealing a larger opening beyond. The mining equipment had been scattered, some pieces bent or broken as if thrown with tremendous force. Sheriff called Dr. Green, who had moved to examine the new opening. "You should see this." The collapse had revealed another chamber, this one clearly not man-made. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in the same strange symbols found in the journal and the ancient book. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, empty but stained dark. "Is that ... blood?" Foster asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Green examined the stains without touching them. "Yes, and recent." A miner who had ventured further into the chamber suddenly called out, "Over here! I found something!" Against the far wall lay a pile of clothing, torn, bloodied shirts and trousers that matched the descriptions of what the Herrera brothers had been wearing. Beside them was a battered leather satchel containing papers, maps, and a small wooden box filled with gold nuggets. Their belongings, Tanner confirmed, examining the papers. Some were covered in the same neat handwriting as the journal, others contained detailed drawings of the canyon and the mine, but still no bodies, Foster observed. As they continued their search, one of the miners approached Tanner with something clutched in his hand. "Found this wedged in a crack in the wall," he said, holding out a pocket watch, not Miguel Herrera's, which they had already recovered, but another, this one with the initials JW engraved on the back. James Wilson, the man who had failed to report that morning. When did Wilson come back here? Tanner wondered aloud, and why alone? The search of the main chamber yielded no further clues, and Tanner led his group toward the narrow tunnel that connected to the altar room. To his surprise, the passage had changed as well. Wider now, tall enough to walk through upright, with smooth walls that seemed to absorb the light from their lanterns. The altar chamber itself had undergone the most dramatic transformation. It was now twice the size, the ceiling arching high overhead. The crude stone altar had been replaced by a larger structure carved from the living rock of the mountain. And the walls, every inch was covered in the strange symbols, freshly carved and arranged in concentric patterns around the altar. "What is this place?" someone whispered. No one had an answer. Even Tanner, who prided himself on his rational approach to investigation, felt a chill of inexplicable dread as he surveyed the chamber. The book is gone, he realized suddenly. The ancient tome he had taken and later returned to its place on the altar had vanished. As they stood in uneasy silence, a distant sound echoed through the chamber, a scraping noise, like stone against stone, followed by what might have been a voice, too faint and distorted to make out words. "That came from deeper in," Foster said, pointing to a dark opening on the far side of the chamber that hadn't been there during their previous visit. Tanner raised his lantern, trying to illuminate the new passage, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light. "We need more men," he decided, "and better equipment. We'll come back tomorrow with—" His words were cut short by a scream, distant but unmistakable, echoing from the new passage. The sound was human, filled with terror and pain, and horribly familiar. "That was Wilson," Foster said, his face pale in the lantern light. Tanner drew his revolver. "Foster, with me. The rest of you, stay here. If we're not back in 10 minutes, get out and bring help from town," before anyone could protest. Tanner and Foster entered the new passage, their lanterns held high, revolvers ready. The tunnel descended steeply, the air growing colder with each step. The walls here were different, not carved or constructed, but natural, as if they followed a vein through the living rock of the mountain. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when Foster suddenly stopped, grabbing Tanner's arm. "Listen," he whispered. In the silence they could hear it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like chanting in a language neither man recognized. And beneath it, almost too faint to detect, a whimpering cry. The tunnel curved sharply, and as they rounded the bend, their lanterns illuminated a scene that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, so large their lanterns couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. Stalagmites and stalactites created a forest of stone pillars throughout the space. Natural columns, formed over countless millennia, rose from floor to ceiling like the supports of some primitive cathedral. But it was what lay in the center of the cavern that froze the blood in Tanner's veins. A circle of stone monoliths, each twice the height of a man, arranged around a central altar much larger and more elaborate than the one above. Atop the altar lay James Wilson, bound and struggling weakly, his clothes torn and bloody. Around him stood figures, at least a dozen, that at first glance appeared to be men. But as Tanner and Foster crept closer, taking cover behind the stone formations, they realized with growing horror that these were not men at all. Their proportions were wrong, limbs too long and thin, heads too large and oddly shaped. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, and though they wore what looked like miners' clothing, tattered and stained, their bodies beneath seemed wrong somehow. Most terrifying of all were their faces, or rather, the lack thereof. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin with slight depressions where eyes might be. "My God," Foster breathed, his voice barely audible. The creatures were engaged in some kind of ritual. They moved around the altar in a slow, synchronized pattern, their blank faces turned toward Wilson. One figure, taller than the rest, stood at the head of the altar, holding the ancient book Tanner had discovered earlier. As it turned the pages, it emitted a series of clicks and whistles that the others seemed to repeat. "We have to help him," Foster whispered, nodding toward Wilson. Tanner assessed the situation grimly. They were outnumbered, in unfamiliar territory, facing enemies of unknown capability. The rational part of his mind, the part that had served him well through 20 years of law enforcement, told him to retreat, get help, return with more men. But Wilson's desperate whimpers cut through his caution. "We'll create a distraction," he whispered to Foster. "Draw them away from the altar. When they move, you get to Wilson and free him. Head straight back the way we came. Don't wait for me." Foster nodded, his young face set with determination despite his obvious fear. Tanner moved quietly to the side, circling behind a large stalagmite. He took aim at one of the stone monoliths and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet striking the stone with a shower of sparks. Immediately he fired again at a different spot, then ran to a new position. The effect on the creatures was immediate and unsettling. They didn't shout or cry out in alarm as humans would. Instead, they moved with coordinated precision, several breaking off from the circle to investigate the gunshots, while others maintained their positions around the altar. Foster seized the opportunity, darting from cover toward the altar. He reached Wilson, who looked at him with eyes wide with terror. "Run!" Wilson gasped as Foster cut his bonds. "For God's sake, run!" Tanner fired again, drawing the attention of more creatures. But as Foster helped Wilson to his feet, the tall figure at the head of the altar turned its blank face toward them. It made a sharp, clicking sound that echoed through the cavern. Immediately, the creatures nearest to Foster and Wilson moved with shocking speed, cutting off their escape route. "This way!" Tanner shouted, firing at the creatures. The bullet struck true, but to his horror they seemed to have little effect. The things staggered slightly but continued advancing. Foster, half carrying the injured Wilson, changed direction, heading toward Tanner's position. They had nearly reached him when one of the creatures leapt forward with inhuman agility, grabbing Wilson's leg. Wilson screamed as he was pulled from Foster's grasp. Tanner fired directly at the creature's featureless face. This time the effect was more pronounced. It released Wilson, recoiling as a dark fluid oozed from the wound, but the others were closing in rapidly. "The book!" Wilson cried, pointing at the tall figure still standing by the altar. "Destroy the book." Understanding flashed through Tanner's mind. The ancient tome, the ritual, the symbols, they were all connected. He took aim at the book in the creature's elongated hands, his last two bullets striking true. The pages erupted in flames, and a high-pitched wail, the first sound they had heard from the creatures, filled the cavern. "Run!" Tanner shouted, pulling Wilson to his feet as the creatures converged on their leader, who was now desperately trying to extinguish the burning book. The three men fled through the tunnel, the unearthly wailing echoing behind them. Wilson could barely walk, and they half carried him between them. Behind them they could hear the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but a strange scraping, sliding noise that seemed to come from the very walls around them. They burst into the altar chamber where the rest of their group waited in tense silence. "Get out!" Tanner bellowed. "Everyone out now!" No one needed further encouragement. They fled through the passages, helping to carry Wilson, whose strength was failing rapidly. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, and as they reached the main chamber, they saw movement in the shadows behind them. Elongated silhouettes, moving with that same unnatural fluidity. "Block the tunnel," Tanner ordered as they reached the mine entrance. Several men pushed the ore cart against the opening, while others used pickaxes to bring down loose rock from the ceiling, creating a temporary barricade. Outside, the day had advanced to late afternoon, the canyon bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. They didn't stop until they reached the horses, quickly mounting and helping Wilson onto one of the spare animals. As they rode away from the mine, Tanner looked back. In the shadows of the entrance, he thought he saw movement, tall, thin figures watching from the darkness, not pursuing further into the sunlight. That night, in the relative safety of Silverton, Dr. Green treated Wilson's injuries, cuts, bruises, and a deep wound on his leg where the creature had grabbed him. But it was the man's mental state that concerned them most. He alternated between terrified silence and bouts of frantic rambling. "I went back for the gold," he confessed during one lucid moment, his voice hollow with shame. "After everyone left, I thought, just a few nuggets. No one would know." His eyes welled with tears, but they were waiting. "They took me to that place. They were going to. The others, what others, James?" Tanner asked gently. Wilson's eyes focused briefly. "The Herreras. I saw them, in a lower chamber. And others too, miners from years ago. They were changed, becoming like them." "Like what, James?" Dr. Green pressed. "What are these creatures?" But Wilson had retreated back into silence, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. Later, alone in his office, Tanner recorded what they had witnessed in his official log, knowing full well that no one who wasn't there would believe it. The strange creatures, the ritual, the ancient book, it all sounded like the delusions of a madman, yet he had seen it with his own eyes. They all had. In the morning he would have to make a decision, return with more men, perhaps military assistance from Fort Briggs, or seal the mine permanently, warning people away from Red Rock Canyon. As he contemplated these options, his deputy arrived with an urgent message. Wilson had escaped from Dr. Green's care, stealing a horse and heading out of town, in the direction of the canyon. He said they were calling him back, the messenger reported nervously. Said he could hear them in his head. Tanner stood, buckling on his gun belt. Some decisions, it seemed, couldn't wait until morning. The first hint of dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky as Tanner and Foster rode out of Silverton, following Wilson's trail. They had been joined by Morgan, whose tracking skills would be invaluable, and two soldiers from Fort Briggs who happened to be in town, Sergeant Davis and Private Reynolds. "He's moving fast," Morgan observed, studying the tracks by lantern light, pushing the horse hard. "At this rate, he'll reach the canyon before sunrise." Tanner nodded grimly. "Then we ride harder." They spurred their horses, galloping when the terrain allowed. The eastern sky gradually brightened, painting the landscape in shades of pink and gold. But Tanner took no comfort in the beauty of the dawn. His mind was fixed on what awaited them at the canyon, and what might have become of Wilson by the time they arrived. As they neared Red Rock Canyon, Morgan called for them to halt. "The tracks change here," he said, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. He slowed down, started weaving back and forth. "Almost like he was drunk or dizzy or fighting against something," Tanner suggested. They proceeded more cautiously now, following the erratic trail. The tracks led not toward the abandoned mine as Tanner had expected, but to another part of the canyon, an area they hadn't explored before. "Look there," Foster pointed as they rounded a bend. About half a mile ahead, a horse stood alone near the canyon wall, occasionally pawing at the ground or tossing its head. Wilson's mount, Morgan confirmed after a quick look through his spyglass. They approached slowly, weapons ready. The horse was skittish, refusing to let them come near at first. When Morgan finally calmed the animal, they found Wilson's hat and gun belt draped over the saddle. "Tracks lead to that crevice in the wall," Morgan said, pointing to a narrow opening in the canyon face, barely visible unless one knew where to look. Sergeant Davis eyed the opening skeptically. What would drive a man to go in there? "Not what," Tanner said quietly. "Who?" The crevice was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Beyond it lay a narrow passage that wound deeper into the rock. They lit their lanterns, the flame barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. "Wilson," Abner called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "James Wilson." No answer came, but as they advanced, they began to notice something odd about the passage. The walls, initially rough and natural, gradually became smoother, more regular, and there were marks, the same strange symbols they had seen in the mine, carved into the stone at regular intervals. "These carvings look old," Foster observed, running his fingers over the symbols. "Very old." "People have been coming to this canyon for thousands of years," Tanner said. "The Paiute, before them the Anasazi, and who knows who else before that." He remembered Mrs. Alvarez's words about ancient ones who dwelled in places where the sun never reached. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a chamber similar to the one they had found in the mine, but smaller and clearly natural rather than excavated. At the center stood a stone altar, cruder than the one below the mine but bearing the same unsettling symbols. "He was here," Morgan said, crouching to examine fresh scuff marks in the dust. "Recently, but where did he go?" Private Reynolds wondered, holding his lantern higher to illuminate the chamber's corners. "There's no other way out, but there was. As they searched the chamber more thoroughly, Foster discovered a shaft in the floor behind the altar, partially hidden by fallen rocks. It descended steeply into darkness with crude handholds carved into the sides. "He went down there," Tanner said, his voice grim with certainty. No one spoke for a long moment, each man contemplating what might lie below. Finally, Sergeant Davis broke the silence. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we should go back for more men." "Whatever's down there will have Wilson by then," Tanner interrupted, "if they don't already." He checked his revolver, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. "I'm going down. Anyone who wants to stay can stand guard here." To his surprise, no one opted to remain behind. One by one, they descended the shaft, Tanner leading the way. The handholds were ancient but serviceable, worn smooth by countless hands over centuries. The shaft descended for perhaps 30 feet before opening into another passage, this one running horizontally. The air was cold and damp with a metallic tang that Tanner now recognized as the smell of the creatures or their dwelling places. They followed the passage cautiously, lanterns held high. The walls here bore more elaborate carvings, not just symbols, but scenes depicting tall, thin figures overseeing smaller human ones. In some images, the humans appeared to be worshipping the elongated beings. In others, they were being led into mountain openings, never to emerge. "What are these things?" Foster whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "The Paiute call them people," Morgan said unexpectedly. When the others looked at him in surprise, he shrugged. "My grandmother was half Paiute. She told stories about them when I was a boy. Said they lived underground, that they were here before humans, that some tribes made bargains with them." "Bargains for what?" Private Reynolds asked. "Protection. Knowledge." Morgan hesitated. "Gold." The passage began to slope downward again, and the carvings became more disturbing. Humans being transformed, their limbs elongated, their faces becoming smooth and featureless. "The Herreras found them," Tanner said as understanding dawned. "Or they found the Herreras made some kind of bargain for the gold. But something went wrong. And now they've got Wilson," Foster added grimly. The passage ended abruptly at a stone door, a slab of rock set into the wall, covered in the now familiar symbols. It stood slightly ajar, a thin line of dim, greenish light visible around its edges. Tanner gestured for the others to douse their lanterns. In the sudden darkness, the strange light seemed brighter, pulsing slightly as if alive. "Weapons ready," he whispered, drawing his revolver. "We go in quiet, find Wilson, and get out. Don't engage these things unless absolutely necessary." The others nodded, their faces tense in the eerie green glow. Tanner pushed the stone door open slowly, wincing at the faint scraping sound it made against the floor. Beyond lay a sight that none of them would ever forget. The chamber before them was vast, not a natural cave, but an enormous excavated space, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. The greenish light emanated from luminescent fungi that grew in patches along the walls and ceiling, casting the entire area in an otherworldly glow. But it was what the light revealed that struck them all to silence. Spread out below, built into the walls and floor of the cavern, was what could only be described as a city, a bizarre, alien city of stone structures that defied human architectural logic. Buildings with impossibly tall, narrow doorways, bridges that connected different levels without apparent purpose, and at the center a massive stepped pyramid topped with an altar larger and more elaborate than any they had seen before. Moving among these structures were dozens of the creatures, their elongated forms gliding with that strange, fluid grace. Some wore tattered human clothing, others were wrapped in what looked like strips of pale hide. "My God," breathed Sergeant Davis. "How long has this been here?" "Thousands of years, at least," Tanner replied, his eyes scanning the underground city. "Maybe tens of thousands." They had emerged onto a ledge that overlooked the city, partially concealed by a stone outcropping. From this vantage point, they could see much of the activity below without being immediately visible. There, Foster pointed toward the central pyramid. "Is that Wilson?" Squinting in the dim light, Tanner could make out a human figure being led up the steps of the pyramid by 4 of the tall creatures. Even from a distance, he recognized Wilson's distinctive gait, though the man moved with a strange stiffness, as if not fully in control of his own body. "We need to get closer," Tanner decided. Staying low, they made their way along the ledge until they found a narrow path that descended toward the city. The route took them behind several of the alien structures, allowing them to move without being immediately spotted. As they drew closer to the center, they could hear sounds, a rhythmic clicking and whistling that seemed to be the creature's form of communication. "They're preparing for something," Morgan whispered as they crouched behind a low wall, watching the activity around the pyramid. "Some kind of ritual." Wilson now stood at the top of the pyramid, surrounded by the creatures. His eyes were open but vacant, his movements puppet-like. Beside him stood the tallest of the beings, the same one Tanner had seen in the mine, now holding what appeared to be a new book, similar to the one Tanner had destroyed, but intact. "We have to stop them," Foster said urgently. "There are too many," Sergeant Davis countered. "We need a distraction." Private Reynolds, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "The structures. Look at how they're built, all stone with those wooden support beams." He pointed to the nearest building. "Those beams look dry as tinder. If we set fires at key points around the perimeter, it could work," Tanner agreed, seeing the logic. "Create enough chaos, grab Wilson, and get out during the confusion." They divided their limited supplies, matches, a small flask of whiskey Sergeant Davis carried, and strips of cloth torn from their bandanas. Reynolds and Davis would circle to the left, setting fires in the structures there. Morgan and Foster would go right. Tanner would make his way toward the base of the pyramid, ready to rush up and grab Wilson when the distraction began. "Wait for my signal," Tanner instructed. 3 shots in the air. The group separated, each making their way carefully through the alien city. Tanner moved from shadow to shadow, drawing ever closer to the pyramid. From his new position, he could see more details of the ritual unfolding above. Wilson stood before a stone basin, his shirt sleeve rolled up. The tall creature was making strange gestures over him while reading from the book, the others forming a circle around them. Tanner couldn't wait any longer. He raised his revolver and fired 3 quick shots into the air. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing throughout the cavern. For a moment everything froze, the creatures turning their blank faces toward the sound. Wilson blinking as if awakening from a trance. Then chaos erupted. Fires bloomed at multiple points around the perimeter of the city, the dry wooden supports catching quickly. The creatures moved with frightening speed, some toward the fires, others searching for the intruders. Tanner used the confusion to race up the pyramid steps, taking them 2 at a time. He reached the top just as Wilson seemed to come fully to his senses, looking around in confusion and terror. "Tanner?" he gasped. "Come on." Tanner grabbed Wilson's arm, pulling him away from the stone basin, which he now saw contained a dark liquid that moved strangely, almost as if alive. The tall creature turned toward them, its blank face somehow conveying rage despite its lack of features. It lunged for Wilson, its elongated fingers grasping at him. Tanner fired directly into the thing's chest, the impact driving it backward. Wilson stumbled, nearly falling down the steep pyramid steps. "The book," he croaked. "Destroy it like before." The book lay open on a stone pedestal. Tanner aimed his remaining shots at it, but the tall creature moved with incredible speed, placing itself between the bullets and their target. It shuddered as the bullets struck, dark fluid oozing from multiple wounds, but it remained standing. More creatures were ascending the pyramid now, cutting off their escape. Tanner grabbed the nearest object, a ceremonial knife from beside the basin, and lunged for the book. He managed to slash across several pages before being tackled by one of the advancing beings. The struggle was brief but violent. Tanner fought with everything he had, but the creature's strength was inhuman. It pinned him to the ground, its featureless face inches from his own. Up close he could see that where eyes should be there were only slight indentations, and the mouth was a small circular opening filled with something that moved and writhed. A gunshot rang out and the creature collapsed atop him. Tanner pushed it off to find Foster standing a few feet away, smoke still rising from his revolver. "The others are waiting at the path," Foster shouted. "We have to go now." Below them, the fires had spread, engulfing entire sections of the alien city. The creatures moved frantically, some trying to save their structures, others in pursuit of the humans who had invaded their domain. Tanner looked for Wilson and saw him struggling with another creature near the edge of the pyramid. As he watched in horror, both Wilson and his attacker toppled over the edge, disappearing from sight. There was no time to search for him. The flames were spreading rapidly, and the air was filling with acrid smoke. Tanner and Foster fled down the pyramid steps, racing through the burning structures toward the path where Morgan, Davis, and Reynolds waited. "Where's Wilson?" Morgan demanded as they began their ascent. "Gone," Tanner replied grimly, pushing them forward. "We need to move." They climbed desperately, the sounds of pursuit growing louder below them. The narrow path made it impossible for more than one person to ascend at a time, briefly giving them an advantage over their more numerous pursuers. As they neared the ledge where they had first entered, Private Reynolds, who was bringing up the rear, suddenly cried out. Tanner turned to see one of the creatures had caught up to them, its elongated arm wrapped around Reynolds' leg. Before anyone could react, it pulled, dragging the young soldier back down the path. Sergeant Davis aimed his rifle, but the angle was impossible. He risked hitting Reynolds. "Go!" Reynolds shouted, struggling with the creature. "I'll hold them off." They had no choice. The remaining 4 men reached the ledge and raced through the stone door, pushing it closed behind them. They could hear Reynolds' screams, suddenly cut short, followed by the scratching and pounding of the creatures against the stone. "It won't hold them for long," Foster panted. "Then we run," Tanner ordered. They fled back through the passages, up the shaft, and through the upper chamber, the sounds of pursuit never far behind. When they finally emerged into the canyon, the sun was high in the sky. They had been underground for hours, though it had seemed like minutes. "The mine," Tanner gasped as they mounted their horses. "We need to seal it too. It's all connected underground." They rode hard for the abandoned mine, reaching it in record time. Using the dynamite that the soldiers had brought, they set charges at the entrance, enough to bring down the entire opening. As the dust settled from the explosion, Tanner surveyed their work. The mine entrance was completely collapsed, tons of rock and debris blocking any exit. "Will it hold them?" Foster asked quietly. Tanner thought of the ancient city, the symbols carved by hands that weren't human, the passages that had existed for thousands of years. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's the best we can do." They returned to Silverton as the sun was setting, their small party now missing 2 men. The story they told of an accident in the mine, a collapse that claimed Reynolds and Wilson, was believed without question. Who would believe the truth? That night, alone in his office, Sheriff William Tanner began writing his official report, carefully omitting any mention of featureless faces or underground cities. Some truths, he had decided, were better left buried, like the creatures themselves. But as he wrote, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The creatures had been there for millennia, hiding beneath the earth. They had survived this encounter, and they would endure long after he was gone. And somewhere in Red Rock Canyon there might be other entrances, other passages leading down to the darkness below. 1 week after the events in Red Rock Canyon, life in Silverton had largely returned to normal. The loss of Private Reynolds was mourned briefly, then forgotten by all but a few. James Wilson, being somewhat of a drifter, was barely mentioned at all. The story of a mine collapse was accepted without question, and most townsfolk avoided the subject out of respect for the survivors. Sheriff Tanner found himself unable to return to his normal routine. Sleep eluded him, his nights haunted by images of featureless faces and underground cities. During the day, he went through the motions of his duties, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the events in the canyon, searching for meaning, for some way to understand what they had encountered. He had sworn Foster, Morgan, and Sergeant Davis to secrecy, and all had agreed readily enough. Who would believe them anyway? But the shared experience had created a bond between the men, and they often found themselves gathering in Tanner's office after hours, speaking in low voices about what they had seen. "I've been thinking about the carvings," Morgan said one evening as they sat around Tanner's desk. "The ones showing humans transforming. What about them?" Foster asked, pouring himself another drink. He had taken to alcohol more heavily since their return, claiming it helped him sleep without dreams. Wilson said he saw the Herrera brothers, that they were changing. Morgan's weathered face was troubled in the lamplight. What if that's what those creatures are, or were? Humans who were transformed somehow. The thought had occurred to Tanner as well, though he had tried to dismiss it. That would explain the clothing, the mining tools they had, he admitted. But how? Davis asked. What could possibly change a man like that? None of them had an answer, though Tanner thought of the dark liquid in the stone basin atop the pyramid, how it had moved as if alive. Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Green entered, looking exhausted and troubled. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you," he said, then hesitated when he saw the others. "Privately, if possible." The men took the hint, bidding Tanner good night and filing out. When they were alone, Doctor. Green sat heavily in the chair across from Tanner's desk. "What is it, Howard?" Tanner asked, noting the physician's unusually haggard appearance. "It's about the mine collapse," Green began carefully. "The official story." Tanner tensed. "What about it?" "I didn't question it at first. God knows I wanted to believe it." Green ran a hand through his thinning hair. Quote, "But as a doctor, I have certain ... observations." "Go on." "The 3 of you, Foster, and Morgan, as well as Sergeant Davis, you've all exhibited similar symptoms since returning. Insomnia, loss of appetite, episodes of disorientation." He leaned forward. "And there's something else. A physical change I've noticed, particularly in Foster, who was closest to... Whatever happened? What kind of change?" Tanner asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "His peripheral vision has expanded beyond normal human range. I tested it yesterday when he came to me complaining of headaches. And his hearing, it's become extraordinarily acute." Green's voice dropped to a whisper. "William, his eyes... When the light hits them at certain angles, they seem to reflect differently, like an animal's." A cold weight settled in Tanner's stomach. "What are you saying, Howard?" I'm saying something happened in that mine, something you're not telling me. And whatever it was, it's affecting you all. Green reached into his bag and withdrew a small glass vial containing what looked like black sand. I found this embedded in Foster's arm when I examined him. He didn't even know it was there. Tanner took the vial, holding it up to the lamplight. It wasn't sand at all, but tiny metallic fragments that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Have you examined yourself thoroughly, Sheriff? Green asked quietly. Checked for similar anomalies? Tanner hadn't, but now that Green mentioned it, there had been a persistent itch on his back, just below his left shoulder blade, a spot he couldn't reach or see. As if reading his thoughts, Green said, "Turn around and take off your shirt. Let me look." Tanner complied, suddenly anxious. He felt Green's cool fingers probing his back, then a sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" Tanner demanded. "There's something here, beneath the skin. A patch about the size of a silver dollar. The skin is ... changing, hardening." Green's voice was clinical, but Tanner could hear the underlying fear. "It's similar to what I found on Foster, but more advanced." Tanner pulled his shirt back on, his mind racing. "Can you remove it? I tried with Foster. Cut it out as best I could." Green shook his head. It was back the next day, larger than before. The implications were horrifying. They ... infected us somehow, Tanner realized. "When we were in their city." Green nodded grimly. "Whatever these changes are, they're progressing. Foster's are advancing more rapidly, perhaps because he was in closer contact with whatever was down there. But you're all affected." He hesitated. "There's something else. Wilson's body, what about it?" "We never found Wilson, that's just it. Yesterday, a group of hunters found a body in the foothills east of the canyon. It was identified as Wilson by the pocket watch he carried, the match to the one you found in the mine." Tanner leaned forward. "Where's the body now?" "In my surgery. I've told no one else what I found during my examination." Green's face was pale. "The body is ... wrong, William. The proportions, the internal organs, they're changing, becoming something else. And the face ... he couldn't continue. "I need to see it," Tanner said, standing. They walked in silence through the darkened streets of Silverton to Green's surgery, a small building behind his home. Inside, on examining table, lay a sheet-covered form. Green locked the door behind them and moved to the table. "Prepare yourself," he warned before pulling back the sheet. What lay beneath barely resembled James Wilson, or any human. The body was elongated, the limbs stretched and thin. The chest had caved inward strangely, the ribs rearranged into an alien configuration. But it was the face that drew Tanner's horrified gaze. The features were half-melted, the eyes sunken into deepening pits, the nose and mouth fusing into what would eventually become that small, circular opening he had seen on the creatures. "My God," Tanner whispered, unconsciously backing away. "It's happening to us, isn't it? We're becoming like them." Green recovered the body. "I don't know. The changes in you and the others are much slower, much less advanced. Perhaps limited exposure means limited transformation, or perhaps it takes repeated contact over time to complete the process." "The Herrera brothers," Tanner murmured. "They found the mine weeks before they disappeared. Wilson said he saw them underground, that they were changing. They'd had much more exposure than we did." Green washed his hands methodically at a basin, a habit from years of medical practice. "There's something else." The hunters who found Wilson's body reported strange noises in the foothills. Clicking sounds, movements in the dark. He turned to face Tanner. "I think they're coming out, William. Whatever we disturb down there, it's not staying contained." The implications were clear. If the creatures were emerging from other exits, if they could survive on the surface, "We have to warn people," Tanner decided. "Evacuate the town if necessary." Green shook his head. "And tell them what? That monsters from beneath the earth are coming for them? They'll think we've gone mad. And what do you suggest?" "Research. Understanding. I've sent telegrams to colleagues in Denver and San Francisco, experts in unusual biological conditions. I've told them only that we're dealing with an unknown contagion. Perhaps they can help us find a way to stop these changes before they progress too far." Tanner thought of the black fragments in the vial, the hardening patch on his back, Foster's changing eyes. And if they can't, Green had no answer. As they left the surgery, Tanner noticed how dark the night had become, the moon hidden behind clouds, the streets of Silverton eerily quiet. For the first time, he found himself appreciating the darkness in a way he never had before, his vision adapting with unnatural clarity to the absence of light. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear something, not quite a voice, but a presence, a calling, the canyon, the depths, home. He shook his head violently, dispelling the thought. How long? He asked Green, his voice rough. How long do we have before we change completely? I don't know, Green admitted. Weeks, perhaps. Maybe months. Wilson's transformation seemed to accelerate toward the end. Tanner made a decision then, one he had been considering since their return. I'm going back, he said, to the canyon. There must be answers there, in the symbols, in the book I damaged but didn't destroy. Something that explains what's happening to us, and how to stop it. You can't go alone, Green protested. And the others are in no condition. I'll take Foster, Tanner interrupted. His changes are advancing faster, as you said. He has the most to lose, the most reason to help. We'll go tomorrow at first light. As he walked back to his office through the sleeping town, Tanner found himself looking at Silverton differently, as an outsider might, as a hunting ground. The thought horrified him, yet he couldn't dismiss it entirely. Whatever was happening to his body was affecting his mind as well. Time was running out, not just for him and the others who had entered the underground city, but perhaps for Silverton itself. For how long before the creatures emerged in force? How long before he and Foster and the others joined their ranks? The sun would rise in a few hours. One last journey to Red Rock Canyon. One last chance to find answers before the darkness claimed them completely. The dawn light found Tanner and Foster already miles from Silverton, riding hard toward Red Rock Canyon. Neither man had slept, their conversation minimal during the journey. What was there to say when both could feel the changes advancing within them? Foster looked worse than he had the previous day, his face gaunt, his movements stiff and awkward. His eyes, once warm brown, now reflected the morning light with an unsettling silvery sheen. How are you holding up? Tanner asked as they paused to rest the horses. Quoster flexed his fingers, which had grown noticeably longer overnight. I can feel it, Sheriff. Inside me. Changing me. His voice had developed an odd, raspy quality. But my mind's still my own, for now. We'll find answers, Tanner promised, though he was far from certain. The explosion sealed the mine, but there must be other entrances. The one we used to find Wilson. They'll know we're coming, Foster interrupted. They single quotes connected somehow. I can feel them, like shadows in the back of my mind. He looked at Tanner with those strange, reflective eyes. Can't you? Tanner could, though he had been trying to deny it. A presence, a pulling, like the tide drawing him inexorably back to the canyon. All the more reason to hurry, he said, mounting his horse. They reached the canyon by mid-morning. The entrance they had used before, the crevice where Wilson had disappeared, was their destination. As they approached, both men felt the pulling sensation strengthen, a mental summons that was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. We need to focus, Tanner said as they tethered their horses. Remember why we're here. To find a way to stop this, not to join them. Foster nodded, though his eyes kept darting toward the crevice with a mixture of fear and longing. They entered cautiously, guns drawn, though Tanner wondered if bullets would be of any use against what awaited them. The passage seemed different than before, wider, smoother, as if it had been deliberately expanded. The symbols on the walls were fresher, more numerous. They've been busy, Foster observed, his voice barely above a whisper. They reached the upper chamber with the crude altar, finding it transformed. The altar had been rebuilt, larger and more elaborate, covered in fresh symbols carved with precision. The shaft in the floor that led to the lower passages had been widened, a proper stairway now descending into the darkness. They're preparing, Tanner realized. For what? I don't know. But this place is more important to them than we realized, as they stood contemplating their next move. A sound from the passage behind them made both men spin around, weapons raised. A figure emerged from the shadows, human in overall shape but wrong in the details. It took Tanner a moment to recognize Morgan beneath the changes that had overtaken him. His body had elongated, his face begun the disturbing transformation they had seen on Wilson's corpse. But his eyes, those sunken and deepening sockets, were still recognizably his own. I knew you'd come back, Morgan said, his voice distorted by his changing mouth. I followed. Had to. The calling. It's too strong to resist now. Jesus, Morgan, Foster breathed. You're further along than either of us. Morgan nodded jerkily. Started changing faster last night. Couldn't stay in town. People would see. He gestured toward the shaft. They're waiting below. All of them. The Herrera as others taken over the years. And the originals, the first ones? First ones, Tanner questioned. Not human. Never were. Morgan's speech was becoming more difficult as his mouth continued its transformation. Ancient, from elsewhere. Deep places. Stars. He pointed to symbols on the wall that looked like constellations. Came here long ago. Need humans to continue. Continue what? Foster demanded. themselves came the rasping reply, dying out. Use us to ... adapt. Survive. Morgan's hand, now elongated with too many joints, clutched at Tanner's arm. Still time for you. Not me. Too far gone, he gestured to his changing body, but found something. In the book. A way to stop it. Hope surged in Tanner's chest. What way? Tell us. Morgan reached into his jacket with difficulty, withdrawing several torn pages from the ancient book Tanner had damaged during their escape. Took these before following you out. Studied them. Symbols. The ritual of purification. His speech was deteriorating further, the words slurring as his mouth reshaped itself. Blood of the unchanged. Fire. Specific words. He handed the pages to Tanner with trembling fingers. Hurry. Ceremony at sundown. Okay, single quotes. LL ... Emerge. Take more. Start with Silverton. His body spasmed suddenly and he clutched at his chest. Can't fight it much longer. Go. I'll hold them as long as I can. We can't leave you, Tanner protested. Morgan's face contorted in what might have been a smile, grotesque with his half-transformed features. Already gone, Sheriff. Do what needs doing. With a final desperate push, Morgan shoved them toward the passage back to the surface, then turned and half-stumbled, half-glided toward the shaft, descending into the darkness below. Tanner and Foster stood frozen for a moment, then reality reasserted itself. They had the pages, possibly their only hope of stopping both their own transformations and whatever the creatures planned for sundown. We need to get these translated, Tanner said, carefully storing the fragile pages inside his coat. Mrs. Alvarez might be able to help. They hurried back through the passage, emerging into the canyon where the sun now stood high overhead. They had hours, not days, to find a solution. The ride back to Silverton was torture, both men fighting the increasing pull to return to the canyon, to descend into the waiting darkness. By the time they reached town, Foster could barely stay upright in his saddle, his transformation accelerating rapidly. They went directly to Mrs. Alvarez's small house on the edge of town. When she answered the door, her expression changed from welcome to horror as she took in their appearance. Madre de Dios, she whispered, crossing herself. What has happened to you? Inside, Tanner laid the torn pages before her, explaining as best he could what they had encountered, what was happening to them, and what Morgan had told them about the ritual of purification. Mrs. Alvarez studied the pages, her face growing graver by the minute. These symbols, some are ancient, older than any language I know, but there are similarities to certain pre-Columbian scripts. She pointed to specific markings. This speaks of cleansing, this of restoration, and this ... She hesitated. What? Tanner prompted. Sacrifice, she said softly. The ritual requires blood freely given, life freely surrendered to counteract the transformation. Foster made a strangled sound. Whose blood? Whose life? Mrs. Alvarez looked up at them with sad eyes. One who is changing but still human enough to choose, to give themselves willingly. The implication was clear. One of them would have to die for the other to be saved, and to stop whatever emergence the creatures planned for sundown. There's more, she continued, turning to another page. The ritual must be performed at the main altar, the one in their city. The sacrifice burns, taking the corruption with it. The words must be spoken precisely. She began copying the phonetic pronunciation of the strange words onto a separate paper. As she worked, Foster's condition deteriorated visibly. His fingers had elongated to the point where he could barely grip objects, and his spine had begun to curve unnaturally. Tanner himself could feel the changes accelerating, his vision altering. Sounds becoming sharper, and the hardened patch on his back spreading across his shoulder blade. How much time do we have? Tanner asked, his voice rougher than before. Mrs. Alvarez glanced at the window, where the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent. 3 hours until sundown, perhaps less. The ritual must be completed before then. She finished her transcription, handing the paper to Tanner. You must speak these words exactly as written, at the moment of the sacrifice. I have included a translation as well, so you understand what you are saying. Tanner looked at the words, then at Foster, whose transformation was now impossible to hide. They both knew what had to happen. Who would make the sacrifice? It should be me, Foster said, his distorted voice barely recognizable. I'm further along. Probably wouldn't survive much longer anyway. Tanner shook his head. We don't know that. And I'm the sheriff. It's my duty to protect this town, these people. He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his pocket alongside his badge. I'll do it. Foster tried to argue, but another spasm racked his changing body, and he doubled over in pain. When he straightened, there was a new emptiness in his silvery eyes. The man receding, something else taking control. "We need to go," Tanner said urgently. Now before we both lose ourselves completely. They gathered what supplies they could. Lanterns, matches, oil. Mrs. Alvarez gave them a silver crucifix, saying it might offer some protection against the corrupting influence. As they prepared to leave, she took Tanner's hands in hers. "You are a brave man, Sheriff Tanner," she said softly. "May God go with you." The ride back to the canyon was a nightmare, both men fighting their own bodies and minds. Twice, Foster nearly turned back, the calling becoming almost irresistible. Only Tanner's increasingly forceful reminders of what was at stake kept him on course. They reached the canyon as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, painting the red rocks with bloody light. Without hesitation, they made their way to the crevice entrance, no longer needing lanterns to see in the dim passage. Their changing eyes had adapted to darkness in ways no humans could. The upper chamber was empty, Morgan nowhere to be seen. They descended the new stairway cautiously, Tanner leading, Foster following with movements that became more fluid, less human with each passing minute. The passage to the stone door was wider now, the carvings fresher and more elaborate. The door itself stood fully open, the greenish light from the cavern beyond spilling into the tunnel. Tanner paused before entering, turning to Foster. "Listen to me. Whatever happens in there, whatever we see or hear, remember Silverton. Remember who you are. Fight it as long as you can." Foster nodded jerkily, his face now so transformed that expressions were difficult to read. But his eyes, still recognizably his, despite their silvery sheen, held determination and fear in equal measure. They entered the vast cavern to find it transformed. The underground city was alive with activity, dozens of the creatures gliding among the structures. The fires they had set during their escape had been extinguished, the damaged areas rebuilt, and atop the central pyramid, a ceremony was clearly in progress. Keeping to the shadows, Tanner and Foster made their way closer, utilizing their new affinity for darkness to remain undetected. As they neared the pyramid, they could see the altar at its summit and what lay upon it. Morgan, his transformation nearly complete, was bound to the stone surface. Around him stood several of the creatures, including the tall leader Tanner had encountered before. It held a ceremonial knife above Morgan's chest, while others made complex gestures with their elongated limbs. "The ritual of emergence," Foster whispered, the knowledge coming to him unbidden through his changing connection to the creatures. "They're using him to strengthen the link between their world and ours." Tanner felt it too, knowledge seeping into his mind from elsewhere. The creatures, the first ones as Morgan had called them, had dwelled beneath the earth for millennia, but their numbers had dwindled, their ability to survive in the upper world diminished. Humans needed to transform them, to adapt and eventually replace them. And tonight, with the ritual of emergence, they would create a permanent pathway, allowing them to extend their influence far beyond the canyon. "We need to get to the altar," Tanner said. "Interrupt their ritual with our own." They began making their way around the perimeter of the cavern, heading for the base of the pyramid. But as they moved, Tanner noticed Foster lagging behind, his movements becoming erratic. "Foster," he called softly. Foster stood rigid, his transformed face turned toward the pyramid. "They know," he whispered. "They can feel us. Our intentions." His voice changed, became more like the clicking, whistling language of the creatures. "Join ... become ... ascend ... He took a step toward the pyramid, not in stealth but openly, as if drawn by an irresistible force. Tanner grabbed his arm. "Fight it, Foster, remember Silverton." For a moment Foster's eyes cleared, humanity reasserting itself. "Can't. Much longer. Go. Finish it." With a sudden, violent movement, he pulled free of Tanner's grip and ran, not toward the pyramid, but toward a collection of strange structures to the side of the cavern. The creatures noticed immediately, several of them breaking off from the ceremony to pursue. Foster had created a distraction, sacrificing his last moments of self-control to give Tanner a chance. Tanner wouldn't waste it. He circled around to the base of the pyramid, then began the ascent, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Near the top, he paused behind a stone outcropping. The ceremony had reached some sort of crescendo, the tall leader now pressing the knife to Morgan's chest, the strange book open beside the altar. The creatures made that eerie clicking sound in unison, building to a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the very stone of the cavern. Tanner removed the crucifix Mrs. Alvarez had given him, kissed it once, then placed it in his pocket alongside his badge. He took out the paper with the ritual words, reading them one last time by the greenish light. Then he uncorked the bottle of lamp oil he had brought, pouring it over his clothing, saving just enough to douse the ancient book when he reached it. Taking a deep breath, he stepped from his hiding place and rushed the final few steps to the altar, The creatures turned as one, their blank faces somehow registering surprise. The leader raised the ceremonial knife, but Tanner was faster, diving past it to reach the book. He poured the remaining oil over its pages, then struck a match. "For Silverton," he said, and dropped the flame. The book caught immediately, the dry, ancient pages eagerly accepting the fire. The leader made a sound, a high-pitched keening that hurt even Tanner's changing ears, and lunged for the burning tome. Tanner blocked its path, positioning himself between the creature and the book. "Now for the rest," he said, striking another match and touching it to his oil-soaked clothing. The flames engulfed him instantly, searing pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. But even as his flesh burned, he began reciting the words Mrs. Alvarez had transcribed, sounds no human throat was meant to make, yet which came more easily to his partially transformed body. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creatures recoiled, their elongated forms twisting as if in pain. The tall leader tried again to reach the burning book, but the flames around Tanner created a barrier it couldn't cross. Through the agony, Tanner continued the ritual, feeling something within him fighting against the words, the corruption, the changes trying to preserve themselves. But his will was stronger. As his life ebbed away in fire and pain, he completed the final phrase, his voice rising above the creature's keening. An explosion of light burst from his burning form, expanding outward in a shockwave that knocked the creatures back. The fire that consumed him changed, turning from orange to a brilliant blue-white that seemed to burn colder rather than hotter. As consciousness began to fade, Tanner saw the creatures writhing, their bodies seeming to unravel where the light touched them. The transformation that had begun in him, in Foster, in Morgan, it was reversing, burning away under the purifying flame. His last thought as darkness claimed him was of Silverton, safe now, at least for a time, and of Foster, hoping that wherever his deputy was in the vast cavern, the ritual's effect would reach him, would save what remained of his humanity. Then there was nothing but the fire, consuming everything, cleansing everything. And finally, blessed darkness. Epilogue. The fire in Red Rock Canyon was visible for miles, a pillar of strange blue-white flame that rose from the earth like a beacon before dissipating into the night sky. The people of Silverton watched in awe and fear, not knowing its cause or meaning. When Sheriff Tanner and Deputy Foster failed to return, a search party was organized. They found the horses tethered near the canyon entrance, but no sign of the men themselves. The crevice entrance had collapsed, sealed by a rockfall that seemed recent yet undisturbed. At the abandoned mine site, they discovered a similar scene, the previous collapse now supplemented by what appeared to be an internal cave-in that had sunk a large section of the canyon floor, creating a natural depression that would eventually fill with rainwater, becoming a small lake. Dr. Green examined the few who had been in close contact with Tanner and Foster during their final days, Sergeant Davis, Mrs. Alvarez, and himself included. The strange physical changes that had begun to manifest in Davis had disappeared completely, leaving him healthy but shaken by the experience. The truth of what happened in Red Rock Canyon was recorded only once, in a letter Tanner had left with Mrs. Alvarez to be opened in the event of his death. That letter, along with the torn pages from the ancient book, was eventually sealed in the town's archives, labeled simply, Sheriff William Tanner, Red Rock Canyon Incident, July 1883, official record. Few ever read it, and fewer still believed its contents. But in the years that followed, the people of Silverton gave Red Rock Canyon a wide berth. Miners refused to work there, despite rumors of rich gold deposits. Hunters found their prey avoiding the area, and travelers reported strange lights sometimes visible deep within the canyon walls, though only at night, and only when the moon was dark. As for the creatures themselves, the first ones, as Morgan had called them, most were destroyed in the ritual of purification, their underground city collapsing when the ritual's power reached its peak. But the legends of the Paiute had existed for thousands of years before the events of 1883, and would continue long after, deep beneath the earth in places where the sun never reaches, in caves and passages older than human memory. Perhaps some survived, waiting, watching, adapting. The mystery of the Herrera brothers remains officially unsolved to this day. Their camp in Red Rock Canyon, Nevada, stands as a footnote in history. Two prospectors who disappeared without a trace in the summer of 1883, leaving behind their equipment, their gold, and a mystery that would never be fully explained, at least not in the official records.